How would you feel if a story were told about the secret history of the Manhattan Project's Ghost Army, spies, adventurers, and daring missions to steal the world's most important resource, heavy water, from the Nazis, a mission that directly impacted the outcome of World War II and the dawn of the nuclear age? The Ghost Army of the Atom, an opening narrative. Hook. Imagine a secret so immense, so volatile, that its very existence could decide the fate of the free world. It wasn't gold, oil, or land. It was a clear, odorless liquid called heavy water. And in the frozen mountains of Norway, a handful of ordinary men were tasked with stealing it from the most ruthless regime in history. If they failed, Hitler would get the bomb. If they succeeded, they would usher in the most terrifying yet transformative age of human history. The Arctic wind howled a perpetual dirge around the Vemork Hydroelectric Plant, a monolithic fortress of concrete and steel clinging precariously to a cliff face above the churning glacial waters of the Mona River in Telemark, Norway. It was here, very deep within a seemingly mundane fertilizer factory, that the fuel for a new world order was being brewed: heavy water, deuterium oxide. To the German Wehrmacht, who had occupied Norway since 1940, Vemork was a jewel, the only place in the world producing D2O on industrial scale. To them, it was the key to unlocking the power of the atom, the silent, invisible engine that would drive their U-235 project, the very core of Hitler's atomic bomb program. But thousands of miles away, in the sweltering heat of New Mexico desert, a shadow government was rising. Officially, it was the Manhattan Engineer District. Unofficially, it was the most expensive and secretive gamble in American history, the Manhattan Project. And its directors, men like Brigadier General Leslie Groves and Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, knew one thing with chilling certainty. Until they controlled the world's supply of heavy water, their colossal effort was constantly shadowed by the threat of Nazi supremacy. This wasn't a race. It was a desperate, high-stakes game of hide-and-seek played across 3 continents. The Americans and their British allies in the Special Operations Executive, SOE, realized they couldn't simply build faster. They had to destroy what the enemy had already built. They needed to launch a precision strike that was part espionage, part sabotage, and entirely suicidal. The Crucible of War. The story begins not with the thunder of bombs, but with the quiet desperation of a science lab. In 1939, a brilliant Norwegian chemist named Leif Tronstad, who helped set up the heavy water production at Vemork, fled to Britain just as the Nazi invasion swept across Scandinavia. He carried in his mind the exact blueprints and operating protocols of the Vemork plant, a treasure trove of intelligence that became the cornerstone of Allied efforts. Tronstad wasn't a soldier, but he became the architect of the sabotage, the mind coordinating a complex attack from a small, windowless office in London. The first attempt to strike at Vemork, Operation Grouse, was a failure shrouded in Arctic fog and bad luck. 4 Norwegian Commandos, known as the Pioneers, parachuted into the harsh, snowbound landscape of the Hardanger Plateau. They were supposed to be the eyes and ears for the main demolition force. They endured brutal isolation, living off lichen and the occasional reindeer, their radio equipment frozen, their communications cut. They were the true ghost soldiers, unseen, unheard, and rapidly running out of hope, yet holding the vital knowledge that Vemork was still churning out heavy water. The Gunners and the Ghost. The main force was an elite British contingent, 34 Royal Engineers of the 1st Airborne Division, codenamed Operation Freshman. They weren't told it was a high-risk mission against an industrial target. They weren't told about the secret ingredient the Germans sought or the nuclear stakes. In November 1942, they took off in two converted Halleck's bombers, each towing an enormous glider. The plan was audacious: land the gliders near Vemork, link up with the Norwegian pioneers, breach the fortress walls, plant the plastic explosives, and destroy the concentration chambers. But the elements and the inherent fragility of the mission conspired against them. Icy weather and powerful downdrafts ripped the tow ropes. One glider crashed into a mountainside, killing several men instantly. The other crash-landed near the coast. The few survivors were quickly captured by Gestapo patrols. What followed was a horrific yet crucial moment in the war. Hitler, incensed by the audacious attack and obsessed with the security of the heavy water, had issued a secret order. All commandos were to be executed, even in uniform. The captured men of Operation Freshman, some wounded, all defenseless, were ruthlessly murdered by the Gestapo. This was a dark victory for the Nazis. The Vemork Plant remained intact, its heavy water tanks filling up, but it solidified the resolve of the Allies. The next strike would have to be different. It would have to be Norwegian. Operation Gunnerside. This is where the legend truly begins. The men selected for the next mission, Operation Gunnerside, were handpicked by Tronstad and SOE Command, chosen not just for their skill, but for their unbreakable ties to the Norwegian soil. They were 6 commandos, all Norwegians, many of whom were veterans of the original Grouse team or had already earned distinction fighting in the Resistance. Their leader was Joachim Ronberg, a young charismatic lieutenant whose quiet demeanor belied a granite-hard will. The team included Knut Haugland, the radio expert who had survived the months of isolation in the first mission, and Jens Anton Poulsen, another of the original pioneers. In February 1943, they parachuted into the same unforgiving wilderness. The German security around Vemork was now impenetrable. Landmines dotted the perimeter, floodlights illuminated the cable car bridge, and heavily armed sentries patrolled the gorge. An attack by land was suicide. An attack by air had failed tragically. Ronberg studied the terrain, relying on the local knowledge that only a native son could possess. He found the answer in the gorge itself, the Mona River Gorge, a terrifying 600-foot chasm that the Germans had unbelievably deemed impassable. The only way into the factory without crossing the heavily guarded bridge or the main road was to descend the gorge, cross the frozen river at its base, and scale the sheer, ice-coated wall on the other side. The night of February 27, 1943, was the night of the strike. Under the glare of the enemy's own floodlights, the team executed a feat of almost superhuman physical and psychological endurance. They slipped across the gorge, used a railway line as a hidden approach, and, using the blueprints Tronstad had memorized, found the vital, unguarded cable tunnel leading directly to the heavy water concentration room. Ronberg and his demolition expert, Knut Haugland, crept into the facility, the clatter of the machinery drowning out their whispers. They swiftly placed the explosive charges on the stainless steel, high-concentration cells, carefully setting the fuses to detonate the charges while leaving the rest of the plant intact, a precise act of sabotage that would make repairs easier for the Norwegians after the war, but cripple the Nazi atomic project immediately. As they fled back into the white silence of the gorge, the muffled thump of the explosion was the sound of a nuclear future being postponed. They had successfully destroyed over 1,000 kilograms of heavy water and the critical equipment needed to make more. The 6 commandos, having evaded a massive German search force, didn't stop there. Instead of retreating, they executed a daring 200-mile cross-country ski escape to the Swedish border, carrying with them the secret of their success and leaving the Nazis scrambling to understand how a fortress had been breached by ghosts.
The long shadow of Vemork. The destruction was a crushing blow to Hitler's atomic ambitions, buying the Allies crucial time. But the Germans were not defeated. Within months, they had rushed repairs, rebuilt the destroyed cells, and were slowly resuming heavy water production. By late 1943, U.S. intelligence confirmed that new shipments of heavy water were being prepared for transport back to Germany. The Allies faced a terrible choice: launch another devastating, high-risk ground attack or bomb the facility from the air. The decision was made to bomb. On November 16, 1943, 161 U.S. B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 8th Air Force dropped over 700 bombs on the Vemork complex. The raid was successful in forcing the Nazis to abandon production, but it came at a terrible cost to the local Norwegian population. The final act of the Ghost Army came shortly after the bombing. The Germans decided to abandon the heavy water entirely, but not destroy it. They loaded the remaining high-concentration stock, about 16 tons of precious deuterium, into barrels and put them on a ferry, the SF Hydro, to be transported across Lake Thyn and then by rail to Germany. Knut Haukelid, one of the original Gunnerside heroes who had stayed behind to lead the resistance, knew this was the last chance. He and his team planned the final strike: sink the ferry. On February 20, 1944, Haukelid and his men smuggled a timed bomb onto the SF Hydro. In the pre-dawn darkness, as the ferry sailed toward the deepest part of the lake, the bomb detonated. The ferry sank rapidly, taking the last critical shipment of heavy water, several German soldiers, and, tragically, a number of innocent Norwegian civilians and their families to the bottom of the icy Lake Thyn. The total elimination of the heavy water threat, a culmination of espionage, sabotage, and an audacious military strike, was complete. This ghost army had fought a secret nuclear war that the public wouldn't know about for decades, ensuring that when the atom was finally unleashed, it was done so by the hands of the Allies, fundamentally shaping the post-war world order and casting a long shadow over the subsequent Cold War.
The 0 hour. At 12:30 a.m., with the moon obscured by cloud cover, Ronenberg and Haukelid led the main assault group. They had to get inside, and quickly. The Pioneers' intelligence had identified a weak point, a railway shunt track used for moving supply wagons. The team used wire cutters to silently snip through the barbed wire fence that the Germans, in a moment of arrogance, had neglected to fully bury in the snow. They slipped along the train tracks toward the main structure. A single Norwegian night watchman, unaware of the Commandos' mission, spotted them. Ronenberg, speaking in Norwegian, ordered him silent and bound him. Crucially, the team had decided not to kill the watchman, adhering to a strict moral code and preventing the Germans from immediately realizing the attack had been carried out by highly trained saboteurs, rather than local resistance fighters. Inside, Ronenberg, guided by Tronstad's mental blueprints, found the narrow cable tunnel leading directly to the heart of the complex, the heavy water high-concentration chamber. They were inside the nerve center of Hitler's nuclear program. Haukelid quickly located the 18 platinum-line cells. These were the targets. The air was heavy with the silence of high-stakes tension, broken only by the low hum of the machinery. They worked with surgical speed, snapping the timed fuses onto the plastic explosives and ensuring the blast would rupture the cells without causing a massive fire or destroying the entire facility. The aim was to leak the precious heavy water into the drains, not merely to flatten the building. Before retreating, Haukelid committed one final, audacious act. He placed a Sten gun outside the chamber door, specifically a British-made weapon. This was a clear message to the Germans. This was not the work of local bandits. This was a strike by the Allied Special Operations Executive. The fuses were set for 30 seconds. The Commandos sprinted back out of the facility, over the railway line, and began their descent back into the silent, black abyss of the gorge. The escape across the plateau. The silent thump. Just as Ronenberg's team reached the bottom of the gorge and were scrambling across the frozen river, they heard it. A muffled thump. A sound utterly insignificant against the vast silence of the mountain, but to them, the sound of global history shifting. The charges had detonated. The heavy water, the 1,000 kilograms of 2O, along with the non-replaceable high-concentration electrolysis plates, began to leak out and disappear into the factory floor drains, rendering the entire facility useless for months. Within minutes, alarms blared across Vemork. Floodlights swept the plateau, German troops roused from their barracks, poured onto the bridge and began searching the perimeter. But the Commandos were already gone, vanished into the impenetrable darkness of the gorge, leaving no tracks on the upper plateau. The Germans, focusing on the obvious points of entry, the bridge and the main road, were baffled. They concluded, incorrectly, that the saboteurs must have fled over the bridge. A massive search party of 3,000 German troops was mobilized, descending into the valley. The long ski. The 9 men knew their only chance was to disappear into the vastness of the Hardened Danger Plateau. They split into 2 groups, not for safety, but to maximize the confusion of their pursuers. Ronenberg's 6-man team headed east. They were carrying all they owned: skis, rifles, and limited rations. Their destination? Neutral Sweden, a grueling 200-mile cross-country ski trek across the highest, most desolate, and most snow-shoveled region of Norway. For 2 weeks, they skied almost non-stop, avoiding settlements, living off meager rations, and their exceptional will. They faced blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, and the constant threat of being spotted by German patrols using planes and dogs. They skied through some of the wildest terrain in Europe, a feat of endurance that elevated the raid from a successful sabotage mission to a legendary saga of human fortitude. On March 18, 1943, after 17 days of brutal continuous travel, Ronenberg and his 5 commandos silently slipped across the border into Sweden, safety and international renown. The Ghost Army had completed their mission. They had halted Hitler's atomic ambition and changed the course of World War II with a single, perfectly executed act of sabotage. The remaining men, Paulsen, Haukelid, and the others, remained in Norway, dissolving back into the resistance, ready for the next inevitable chapter in the secret war over the atom. Their work, as they soon discovered, was far from over. The incredible success of Operation Gunnerside provided a moment of immense relief for the Allies, but it was fleeting. The Germans were furious, yet determined. They poured manpower and resources back into Vemork, and by the summer of 1943, intelligence reports reaching the Manhattan Project's headquarters in New York indicated that the Nazis were not only repairing the damage, but were on the verge of resuming heavy water production. The Ghost Army would have to strike again, this time with a catastrophic finality. The inevitable airstrike. The German scramble. The German response to the sabotage was swift and, to the Allies, deeply alarming. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself ordered an investigation, and while the physical damage to the high-concentration cells was severe, the overall plant structure was intact. The Nazis brought in specialized technicians in slave labor, working around the clock under immense pressure.
By October 1943, the German atomic program directors, led by the renowned physicist Holm Heisenberg, believed they could restart full production within weeks. The information was relayed to General Groves, director of the Manhattan Project. Groves, watching the astronomical budget of the American project climb higher every day, viewed the persistent threat of a Nazi atomic bomb as intolerable. The Norwegians had performed a miracle, but a repeat ground attack was deemed too risky given the now fortress-like German security. The only remaining option was a massive airstrike. The decision was devastating. An air raid meant certain death for many Norwegian civilians and the potential destruction of the entire Ryukin Valley, a far cry from the surgical strike performed by Ronenberg's team. However, the stakes were too high to hesitate. The bombing of Vemork. On November 16, 1943, the skies over Telemark filled with the droning roar of Allied planes. A massive formation of 161 U.S. B-17 flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force descended upon the Vemork plant. The target was the specific cluster of buildings housing the heavy water production cells and the power-generating machinery. The raid was devastating. Over 700 high-explosive bombs rained down on the isolated industrial complex. The German anti-air defenses were surprisingly ineffective, and the bombs ripped through the concrete and steel. Heavy water production ceased immediately. The entire area was rendered non-operational, but the collateral damage to the local community was significant, forcing many Norwegian workers and their families to flee the valley. For the American war effort, the bombing was a tactical success. It bought them more time to finish their own reactor at Hanford and their bomb design at Los Alamos. The final stake, Operation Swallow. The retreat of the 2-0. While the airstrike rendered the plant useless, it presented the Germans with a new, urgent problem: what to do with the existing stock of heavy water. They had accumulated a shipment of nearly 16 tons of 2O still in low concentration form, along with the partially processed material that had survived the Gunnerside explosion. The Nazi High Command ordered it immediately salvaged and shipped out of Norway to be processed in Germany. The route chosen was a combined rail and ferry journey, by train from Ryukin to the edge of Lake Tin, across the lake via the rail ferry SF Hydro, and then by train again to the coast and onward to the Reich. Waiting in the shadows was Kenneth Haukelid, the demolition expert from the Gunnerside team who had remained in Norway leading the resistance cell codenamed Operation Swallow. Haukelid realized this was the final critical moment. The airstrike had destroyed the factory, but this last shipment, a massive concentration of the vital fluid, could still jumpstart Heisenberg's reactor experiments back in Germany. The ferry hydro had to be stopped. Haukelid faced an agonizing ethical dilemma. The ferry hydro was not a military.
The Manhattan Project's relieved architects. General Groves and the sigh of relief. The true significance of the Vemork missions was understood only by a tiny, powerful cabal in the United States. General Leslie Groves, the relentless and driven director of the Manhattan Project, received the reports of the hydro sinking with a rare moment of personal satisfaction. For 3 years, the potential of a German atomic bomb had been his greatest operational nightmare. Groves viewed the heavy water missions not as sabotage, but as a critical strategic preemptive strike that saved the U.S. project untold months and billions of dollars. The Norwegian saboteurs had bought the Manhattan Project the only currency that mattered: time. Had the German D2O reached Werner Heisenberg, it would have accelerated his experimental pile in Hagerlach, near Berlin. While Heisenberg's team struggled with miscalculations and resource shortages, The consistent supply of heavy water would have pushed them across the threshold of a self-sustaining chain reaction, the ultimate proof of concept necessary for a fission bomb. The Norwegian missions denied them that critical step, effectively making the Allied bomb development a unilateral, unchallenged race. The scientific rivalry, Heisenberg versus Oppenheimer. The story now shifts to the high-stakes, intellectual battle being waged across the Atlantic. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director at Los Alamos, and his brilliant multinational team were racing against an unseen clock, the possibility of a breakthrough by the German genius Werner Heisenberg. The American scientists were fully aware of Heisenberg's stature. The very best minds in physics, including many German immigrants who had fled Hitler, were haunted by the idea that their former colleague might succeed first. The Vemork sabotage was the constant, necessary counterpoint to their anxiety. Every time news of the successful demolition or the sinking of a shipment arrived, it was a confirmation that the technological head start lay with them. This relief allowed the Los Alamos team to focus on the intricate, mind-bending challenges of implosion physics and the design of the plutonium bomb without the crushing pressure of an imminent Nazi threat. The Alsos mission and the final prize, the hunt for German science. Even after the Normandy invasion, the Allies remained paranoid about a hidden Nazi weapons program. This paranoia fueled the Alsos mission, a top-secret American effort launched shortly after D-Day. Alsos was a combined intelligence, scientific, and military unit tasked with following Allied troops through liberated Europe to capture German scientists, destroy their atomic materials, and, most importantly, confirm whether Hitler had the bomb. The unit was led by Colonel Boris Pasch, an intense security officer, and guided by the brilliant Dutch physicist Samuel Goudsmit. Their goal was to find the last remnants of the German nuclear effort before the Soviet Red Army did. The capture in Heiserloch. The Alsos mission eventually tracked the core of the German nuclear effort to a small, unassuming cave beneath a cliff in the village of Heiserloch, southern Germany. Here, in a converted beer cellar, Heisenberg and his remaining team had built their final, desperate reactor experiment. When the Alsos team stormed the cave in April 1945, they found no bomb, only the unfinished reactor cube buried in a water pit. They found only 664 cubes of natural uranium, far too little for a critical reaction, and no heavy water, none of the vital D2O that was sunk in Lake Tin. The only neutron source they could find was a tiny, inconsequential sample. The realization was a profound moment for Goudsmit. The German program had not been stopped by the Americans. It had been stalled and crippled years earlier by the Norwegian Commandos. The Ghost Army's actions had directly resulted in the pathetic, insufficient state of Heisenberg's final experiment. The German scientists, including Heisenberg, were swiftly captured and taken to a secure location in England, Farmhall, where their conversations were secretly recorded. These recordings confirmed the ultimate truth. The Germans were years behind. When they heard the news of the Hiroshima bomb, they were genuinely shocked, revealing that they had never believed the Americans could finish the weapons so quickly. Their own program had been crippled by poor management, competition, and most significantly, the persistent surgical actions of the men on skis in Telemark. The Cold War shadow. From resistance fighters to nuclear strategy. The story was concluded by showing how the triumph in Norway immediately gave way to the anxieties of the post-war world. The success of the Manhattan Project led directly to the Cold War and a global arms race. The Commandos of the Ghost Army became vital yet unsung heroes in this new conflict.
Men like Knut Hakalid later became military attachés and leaders in Norwegian defense, using their intimate knowledge of sabotage and clandestine operations to build Norway's defenses against the new Eastern threat, the Soviet Union. Their mission set a precedent for the ability of small, elite special operations forces to engage in strategic sabotage that could alter global power dynamics. The Vemork missions became a foundational text for the newly formed CIA and other Western agencies, proving that a single, high-risk, low-footprint mission could achieve effects that entire armies could not. The legacy of the heavy water missions, therefore, is not just a tale of daring action, but an essential historical hinge. It is the story of how a handful of determined Norwegians, fighting on skis in the frozen dark, ensured that the terrifying dawn of the nuclear age began in the Western Hemisphere, shaping the next half-century of global politics.